Maybe you have a fear of a baby grabbing your microphone while you're trying to pray. Do you have any fears? Let me tell you about one of my fears. I have a fear of bees. I have a fear of wasps. I have a fear of hornets. I have a fear of anything that is yellow and black. So if you wonder why I avoid you in the lobby, look at what you're wearing. I have this fear of bees and wasps and hornets, and it causes me to do irrational things. I've had this fear since I was a child. What happens is that it causes me to hate things like eating outdoors. So a few years ago, we built this great deck, and we started to furnish it. It has a place where we can sit and lounge, a great swing. It has a barbecue. It has our table with a nice umbrella so we can eat outside all the time, right? I hate eating outside. Because I don't know about you, but in our backyard, what inevitably happens is that these wasps come, and they start to circle around the food, right? And that scares me. That freaks me out. And so I run back inside. And so I can count the number of times we ate outside this year, once on Mother's Day, because I have to do what my wife says on Mother's Day. I hate bees. It's a fear that I have. It's irrational. My wife is not afraid of them. My wife is not afraid of wasps or hornets. When a wasp comes around, you know what she does? She swats at it, which we all know makes them mad. So what do? I run away screaming. Because I hate bees. It's just this fear that I have within me. Do you have fears like that? Do you have fears that cause you to do irrational things? What fear do you have? I want you to turn right now to the person next to you. Tell them what fear you have. Just tell them what it is. Go ahead, do that. Some of you are like, I'm not going to do this because that's your fear. What fear do you have? Do you have any fear? Some of us have lots of fears. Some of us fear public speaking, like this, right? They fear being up on a stage. Some of us fear being the example that the pastor talks about on Sunday morning, kind of like Destiny Brown, whose birthday it is today. And she has this fear of being called out. I love you, Destiny. We have these fears of bees. We have these fears. I know someone who has a fear of water. I know another person who has a fear of balloons. Another person that has a fear of clowns. And we have these fears all over the place that cause us to do irrational things and to act in ways that surprise other people because we don't expect them to have these fears, right? And we've been in this series for the last number of weeks called Under the Surface. And this series called Under the Surface is all based on a proverb that says, above all else, guard your heart, for out of it flows the wellspring of life, meaning that everything that's in your life flows out of your heart. And Jesus said, out of the overflow of the mouth, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Which says the words that you say or the way that you react to the things around you is all driven by what's in your heart. And in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the word heart is interchangeable with the word soul. And so what's in your soul or what's in your heart determines the way you act and the way you talk, the way you react, the way you treat other people. And so we've been looking at what's in our souls because we believe an important thing. We believe that if the things that are in our soul are brought into the light, that they lose all power and that things can begin to change. That if the secrets that are hiding in your soul, if the secrets that are hiding in my soul are brought into the light, that they lose their power and we can begin to live a different life. That's why we talked about the things we talked about today, because I don't want any secrets between you and me. I'm going to bring into light things that I've done because I don't want them to have power. I don't want them to control me. And when it comes to fear, not the fear of bees and not the fear of water or balloons, although those are significant things. But when we talk about fear, there are fears that actually get rooted down in our heart, in our soul, that begin to change the way that we respond to people. And what happens is that when these fears are rooted in our heart and we give in to them, we let those fears control us, it grows and it breaks relationship with the people around us and it breaks relationship with God. Do you have any fears rooted in your soul? Some of us know them very well. Some of us don't. Today, in the time we have together, I want to talk to you about the fears that may be rooted in your soul today. And I want to give you 3 ways to bust the fears in your life. To do this, we're going to look at the example of 2 guys in the Old Testament. They are in the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. We're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 9. We're going to jump into 9, 10, and then 11. Then we're going to jump to 2 Samuel. So if you have your Bibles, be ready for that. If you don't have a Bible, there's blue ones at the back. And you know what? If you don't own a Bible, please take one. Because this is our gift to you. Because we believe that the Bible holds instructions for how to live. And it holds the most important instructions for how to live with God as a person of faith. And in 1 Samuel chapter 9, we're introduced to a man named Saul. Saul is the first of the 2 men that we're going to look at. Both men had fear that just was full on in them, and yet they reacted in 2 very different ways. And from their story, we can learn how to deal with fear in our story. And in 1 Samuel chapter 9, it says this: there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish. And then it tells you all of his relations. And here's what I want you to know from that first verse, is that this man named Kish, he was a powerful person. He was rich, most likely. He was well respected. He had power. And it says in verse 2 that Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. Wouldn't you love to be described that way? That's how they talk about me, right? You're laughing. I don't know what that means. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. And so what I want you to understand about Saul is that Saul was from a good family. In fact, the way that he's described here, let's put it in modern terms, he would be the captain of the football team. He would be the president of the student body. He would be that person that gets everything they ever want, and it always goes their way, and they never seem to do anything wrong. You know those people in your life, right? He's that kind of a person. He's handsome. He's taller than everyone else. Everybody likes him. Everybody respects his family. He's from the right side of the tracks. This is Saul, but here's what I want you to know, and you're going to see it as we talk about him today. That there was something rooted deep down in Saul's soul that was impacting his life, impacting everything that he did, and that threatened to steal what God wanted to do in his life. And that thing was fear. And here's the principle I want you to understand, and watch for the fear as we read through Saul's life. The principle is this, is that fear doesn't discriminate. That the person you least expect to have fear in their life is probably consumed with fear. Because fear doesn't discriminate. And you may think, I don't have any fears. You may be surprised. Because we all have fears. It's common to all of us. But how we deal with our fears, that's what makes the difference in our life. And it goes on in 1 Samuel 10. What we find in 1 Samuel 9 is that Kish has all of these animals, and there's some donkeys that go wandering away, and he sends Saul, his son, to go and find these donkeys. And so Saul goes and does that, but he's having trouble finding them. And so he decides that, you know what, there's this prophet, this guy who speaks from God, who can actually tell us things we don't know, because God often imparts words of wisdom to us if we're listening to him, about things we don't know that can help us. God loves to do that, words of wisdom. Do you have that gift? Samuel had this gift. And Saul comes to Samuel and he asks, he's going to ask where his donkeys are. But Samuel had heard from God something else. Not about the donkeys, although the donkeys are mentioned, but something much more important. You see, what had happened is the people of Israel, where Saul lived, they wanted to have a king. They had lived for centuries with a tribal system of ruling. But they looked around at other people in other countries and said, everybody else has a king, why don't we have one? Do you see a fear within that? There's this fear of, why aren't we like everybody else? Have you ever felt that fear? That maybe somebody will notice you're different? A whole nation had fear in their soul. They wanted to be like everybody else. They didn't want to be rejected or ridiculed or made fun of because they didn't have a king. So they said, God, give us a king. And Samuel hears from God, and God says, it's not my plan, but I'll do it because I love my people. And so Saul comes to find out, where are my donkeys? And Samuel, it says in chapter 10, it says this, Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him. Awkward. Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? In other words, Saul, you're going to be king. And then he says, when you leave me today, you will meet two men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, the donkeys you set out to look for have been found, and now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about his son. He's asking, what shall I do about my son? And you know what? Saul sets out, just as Samuel said. And two men come up to him at the place where Samuel says, and says, your donkeys have been found, just as Samuel said. Incredible, right? But wait, there's more. Verse 3, then you will go from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. 3 men going up to worship God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 of the 3 loaves of bread, which you will accept for them. Okay, who in their right mind is traveling, right? And it's like, oh, here's this one guy who's traveling. Let's give him 2/3 of the bread that we're traveling with, right? You don't do that. And yet Samuel says, here's this improbable thing that's going to happen. And guess what? It happens just as it says. But there's more. Because he says after that, you'll go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you'll meet a procession of prophets, people who hear from God, like Samuel, coming down from the high place with lyres and timbrels and pipes and harps. It's a worship team on wheels. Eric, we got to get one of those. Being played before them, and they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. And that's exactly what happens. Saul goes to this place. There's this band. There's these prophets. All of a sudden, the Spirit comes upon him, and he starts prophesying. In fact, it says, there's this saying we find out if we keep reading the chapter where it says that Saul has started a school of prophets in Israel. He'd never done this before, but it happens. And God doesn't do this just to say, isn't this cool? He doesn't tell Samuel to tell Saul all these things just to kind of say, look what I can do. God is doing this for a purpose. He says in verse 7, he says, once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. And the reason why God tells Samuel to tell Saul all of these things is because Saul's just heard this news. You're going to be king. And Samuel says, here's the proof. These 3 prophecies are all about you. They're all going to happen today. And then you'll know that God is with you. And anything you do will be successful because God is with you. And it happens just like he says. Can you imagine? Put yourself in that situation. How would you react that day? What would you do? I mean, if someone came up to you and said, hey, how was your day? And that had happened to you, what are you going to say? I've got a story to tell you. Wait till you hear this, right? Isn't that what you're going to do? Right? No? Just me? We're all going to do that, right? But listen to what Saul does. Now, this is chapter 10, verse 14. We're jumping a little bit. Now, Saul's uncle asked him and his servants, where have you been? What was your day? Saul says, looking for the donkeys. But when we saw they were not to be found, we went to Samuel. Saul's uncle said, tell me what Samuel said. Saul replied, he assured us that the donkeys had been found, but he did not tell his uncle what Samuel had said about the kingship. Okay, important detail, right? Like that is the headline of what has happened here. You're going to be king, Saul. And your uncle says, what happened today? Anything exciting? No, boring day, right? No, someone tells me I'm going to be king. I'm going to be like, yep, let's get the throne. Let's get this going on. Let's have it happening. Saul says, nope, nothing's going to happen. You see what happens when we're filled with fear? And Saul, we're going to get more of a taste for what his fear is. But when we're filled with fear like Saul is, we're not going to share the things that we're afraid might bring about our fear. And Saul has this fear of rejection. He's afraid that people will reject him. So he's not going to tell anybody that he's going to be king. Because what's going to happen if it doesn't happen, right? He'll be humiliated. He's scared of this. And so he doesn't tell his uncle. And what Samuel does, in the meantime, Saul goes home, Samuel goes, and he rounds up all the people of Israel, and he brings them all together, and he says, you know what, God has answered your request, and you're going to get a king. And he says, and in fact, the man is here right now. And they start this kind of procession. And it's like, who's going to be the king? And it says they come to the family of Kish. And finally, Saul, son of Kish, verse 21 of chapter 10, was taken. But when they looked for Saul, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, has the man actually come? This is what they asked God. It's like, God, you said you're going to give us a king, and everybody's here, where they're all gathered, all the important, powerful people, but we don't see this person that you've said is going to be king. And the Lord says, yes, he's hidden himself among the supplies. He's with the luggage right now, hiding. Okay, person who's taller than everybody else in the room, person who God has said, you're going to be king, and here's the proof, 3 prophecies. Where's he? Hiding with the luggage. This is Saul's fear, that it's not really going to happen, that I'm going to be rejected by the people. And so he hides himself from the people. He hides himself from his uncle. This is what fear does in us. It starts to break relationships. It causes us to hide from the things that God has called us to do. What is the fear lurking in your heart? What we see in Saul's life is that Saul demonstrates a life that is transformed by fear. Everything he does is driven by this fear that he has of insignificance and rejection. In fact, after he's crowned king, it says that there were people there and they were like, long live the king. But then it says in verse 27 of chapter 10, it says, but some scoundrels said, how can this fellow save us? And you know what? Saul heard them. It says, they despised him and brought him no gifts, Saul. But Saul kept silent. And Saul heard what they whispered, and they despised Saul, and he took that in his heart. And you remember the prophecy that Samuel gave? Whatever you set your hand to, you will do. And God had chosen a king for one purpose, to unite the people and to defeat their enemies. I guess that's 2 purposes. To unite the people under one banner and defeat the Philistines. And so Saul, there's this coronation, he becomes king. Everybody's like, long live the king. They're excited because finally they're going to be united and they're going to defeat their enemies. What does Saul do? Chapter 11 tells us. It tells us that Saul, after being crowned king, goes farming. That's what he does. You see, in chapter 11, what we read is that when all of the Philistines heard that Israel had selected a king, that they came to attack the Israelites. And the Israelites are like, oh my goodness, we're being attacked. Let's go get our king to lead us into battle. And so they go and they find Saul in chapter 11, verses 4. When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul, to his house, in other words, and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he said, what's wrong with everyone? Where's Saul? He's supposed to be leading. He's supposed to be leading people against the Philistines. Where's he? He's behind some oxen. Do you see how he's hiding? How his fear of being insignificant is actually coming true. How his fear of rejection, that'll never come true because he's just going to hide from everything that God calls him to do. But something happens when Saul heard the words. It says in verse 6, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. And you see, there's something that happens in Saul's life, is that Saul has this fear rooted in his life, but when the Spirit of God comes upon him, when he went home and ran into that group of prophets, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and suddenly he spoke powerfully and things that he didn't know. And when they came to him when he was farming and told him the awful things that were happening in the country, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, all of a sudden he's brave and he goes and gets them, and they defeat the Philistines. You see, Saul demonstrates a life transformed by fear. But when the Spirit comes, that fear is transformed. The unfortunate thing is that Saul gives more into fear than into the Spirit in his life. And what we see in his life from this point on, and in your groups this week, I want you to take a survey of Saul's life and just kind of read through the next chapters and see all the times that he's filled with fear. He has this fear of being rejected by his men. And so when they go into battle, he offers a hasty sacrifice. He won't wait for Samuel to come like he's been told, and he offers a hasty sacrifice. Why? Because he fears his men will leave him. He goes into battle again, and God says, I want you to destroy all of the plunder, all of the things from this battle. It is all sacred. Destroy it all. And Saul's men say, no, there's some good stuff here. And Saul is scared of his men, and so he lets them keep the plunder instead of destroying it. David, a young man, comes along, and he's anointed to be the next king. And Saul knows this. Okay, this was not a secret. Saul knew this. And how does he respond? He throws spears at David. He doesn't set up a succession plan to say, okay, I guess God is done with me. Maybe I need to bring somebody else in. David here. No, he tries to kill David. For the rest of his life, basically, he chases David, trying to kill him instead of setting him up for success when he's finally done. And what he leaves is a country in civil war because of it. Fear drives everything that Saul does in life. At the beginning, he has this chance because the Spirit is coming upon him and changing him, transforming those fears. But as it goes along, Saul chooses fear instead of the Spirit. And his life is transformed, but not in a good way. And this is what happens with us when we let fear take root in our lives, that it begins to change who we are. And it keeps us from becoming who Jesus envisions for our life. I said this was about two men. Let me tell you about the second one. Saul, who is so consumed with fear, actually, so consumed that he doesn't want to be disgraced or rejected, that when he's in battle and things are going poorly, he kills himself instead of being captured and humiliated. Fear. A civil war breaks out. One of Saul's sons tries to become king. Another man, David, who I've mentioned, has already been anointed king, also tries to become king. After the civil war is finished, David becomes king. And the Philistines, remember what happened with Saul? The Philistines heard that Saul was king and they came and attacked. The Philistines hear that David has become king. Same situation. 2 Samuel chapter 5 tells us about this. The Philistines hear that David is now king, and once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So the valley of Rephaim is on the west side of Jerusalem. It is where all of the food is prepared for Jerusalem. All of it is grown there. And so to take over this field, all of a sudden you're going to starve Jerusalem out. Verse 23 of chapter 5 in 2 Samuel says, So David went into the fortress, to the stronghold, and David inquired of the Lord. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands? See, David had fear, okay? The Philistines come against him. He has fear because what does he do? He goes to the stronghold. He goes to the safe place. But he doesn't let fear transform him. Instead, he takes his fear to God. And he says, God, what should I do? These people are coming against me. What should I do? And God says, go this way and do this, and you'll succeed. And guess what he does? The second time, the Philistines come, a little later on in that chapter. Same thing happens again. They fill up the valley where all the food is. They try to starve them out. And David, it says, inquired of the Lord. And he answered, don't go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike down the Philistines. And that's exactly what David does, and that's exactly what happens. David wins both battles. David is not a man who is fearless. He is a man who experiences fear just like you and me, but what he does with the fear makes all the difference. Instead of taking things into his own hands, as Saul did, and trying to solve his fears, he takes what he has, the fear within him, to his Lord. And this makes all the difference. This makes all the difference. And in fact, this is what David does again and again. You know how I know this? Because we can read the songs that David wrote. And there's a ton of them that sound like David is just scared to death. In fact, this psalm you probably know off by heart, or you've probably heard it many times. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Anybody know that song? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside still waters. Do you know what that psalm was written probably for? This is what scholars believe. Is that psalm was written when David was on the run from his son Absalom, who was trying to kill him. And David takes his fear to God and says, I'm not going to fear anything. That you make a table in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head and my cup overflows. I'm not going to be afraid because you are the shepherd that's with me. This is the difference between David and Saul. One let fear consume him. The other took his fear to the Lord and let the Spirit transform him. You see, if Saul describes a life transformed by fear, David describes a life transformed by the Spirit. When we take our fear to him, whatever it is, he transforms it. You know, fear does three things to us. Fear stops us from acting. It paralyzes us. We see this again and again in Saul's life. At his coronation, instead of standing up proud that God has chosen him and he's hiding, it paralyzes him. He can't do this. He goes home after his coronation and just goes back to farming like he used to do because fear has consumed him. It's kind of interesting. I compared the disciples after Jesus' resurrection. They don't know what the future looks like. What do they go and do? They go back to fishing. And sometimes instead of doing what God has called us to do, too often we go back to the old routines in our life. And that's fear. We know that God has called us to do something, but we don't do it. That's fear. Because God has called us to be something different, to do something different in our life. But fear just wants to keep us inactive, keep us paralyzed. If you surrender to the Spirit, you can begin to move forward. Fear also cuts us off from other people. So I told you David had been anointed king, and Saul, who's consumed with fear of being rejected, of being insignificant, he will not let David take the throne. I wonder how Israel would have been different if Saul had said, God's chosen someone else. David, let me help you become the king that Jesus envisions. And some of us have young people under us, and the fear that we have in us is that if we retire, if we let go of the reins, if we whatever, we will not be significant. We will not be important. And so we hold on instead of giving over. And what would happen in the relationship with other people if we actually just trusted God instead of giving into our fears of being nothing? Fear cuts him off completely from David. It begins to cut him off from his sons because his son Jonathan is good friends with David. And Saul's fear starts to try and manipulate Jonathan to not spend time with David. And fear chases him and breaks relationship. And ultimately, fear destroys Saul's relationship with God, because that's what fear does. You see, when we yield to fear, whatever it may be in our life, when we give into it, what we actually do is we are saying that the fear, whatever that may be, is more powerful than God. And we make fear an idol in our life. And we worship at the feet of that idol because we're more scared of whatever is going to happen than we are of God. And we make fear an idol. And ultimately, it destroys our relationship with God. And Saul gets to this point where he is so consumed with fear that he'd rather turn to a witch than he would to God for advice. He goes to a witch in order to summon back Samuel from the dead to get advice, rather than turn himself to God, who chose him, who gave him his spirit, who gave him the ability to hear God. Remember, Saul was a prophet at the beginning, but at the end he can't hear God because he's so given into fear that it's destroyed that relationship. So how do we live differently? How do we break the fear in our life? Let me give you 3 ways, 3 fear busters. We see them in David's life. The first one is, when you experience fear, when you feel it coming on, worship God. This is what David did. He wrote psalm after psalm about his fear, and if you read the psalms, there's this interesting movement through these songs that it starts out in a place of fear, and then all of a sudden he's praising God. Because all of a sudden, worship, what it does is it turns our attentions and our affections off of our fears and to God who can actually do something about it. Philippians 4:6-7 says, if you're anxious about anything, and substitute the word fear, because that's what anxiety is. If you're anxious about anything, present your request to God with thanksgiving in your heart. Why thanksgiving? Because the psalmist says we enter into the presence of God with thanksgiving and with praise. And he says, with thanksgiving, you enter into the presence of God, and when you get into the presence of God, present your request to God like you would at a king, and guess what he does? He gives you a peace that passes all understanding. We worship God and we come into this place where fear is pushed out. Whenever I feel fear these days, there's this song that I just start singing. It's that fear doesn't stand a chance when I'm standing in your love. I start to sing songs that worship God because then I know that fear it starts to shrink and it starts to go away. And worship God when you feel fear, because it orientates to who's really in charge and who can really make a difference in your life. The second thing that you can do to bust the fear in your life is act in love. Act in love. 1 John 4:18 says that there is no fear in love. That perfect love casts out all fear. The context of that verse is a discussion about how God is love and how anyone who loves or acts in love, it's not that we have these warm butterfly feelings, right? But actually anybody who does something out of the motivation of expressing love to someone else is actually in the presence of God. This is how we know who God's people are, because they act in love. If someone's lashing out, God's not there. If they are acting in love and compassion, that's where God is. And friends, if you want to get rid of the fear in your life, be where God is. Even though it scares you. Be where God is. Because there is no fear when you are in the presence of God, because God is love. So act in love to the people you are scared of. Act in love in situations where you feel fear. And you will find yourself in the very presence of God. And here's what I know, perfect love, that's God, casts out all fear. And when we experience fear, the last thing we want to do is act in love or have a gentle response. When we feel fear, we want to fight or flight. But act in love and find the presence of God in the midst of that fear. And the last one that you can do to bust the fear in your life is surround yourself. Surround yourself with mighty warriors. This is what David did. David in 2 Samuel had all of these warriors that were around him. In fact, there's a whole chapter about his mighty warriors. It kind of seems out of place because you're reading the story of David's life and the plot is moving forward, and then all of a sudden it's a list of people. And it's like, what is this all about? Why do I care who these people were? I want to know the story of David. And it's there for a reason, because in the midst of this, there's little tidbits that we understand about David. For example, there was this time when David wanted a drink of water from the spring in Bethlehem, his hometown, the place where he grew up. He said, if only I had a drink from this well, but he was scared to go because he thought that Saul and his men would capture him. But there were some mighty warriors who snuck into Bethlehem and got a glass of water and brought it back to David. Because they weren't as scared of it. There was no fear that they would get captured. They bring it to David, and David has this cup of water from his hometown. Do you know what he does? He dumps it out on the ground, which makes no sense to you and me because he wanted to drink it, right? Here's the thing. He pours it out on the ground as a worship, an act of worship, an offering to God, saying, I would rather give this to God than drink it myself because it is that precious. And what's happened is that these mighty warriors who were not afraid where David was afraid, they were not afraid. They go and they do this great thing and they lead David into an act of worship, into the very presence of God. Friends, who do you have around you who will go and get water from places where you fear to go and bring it back to you so that you can go into the very presence of God? Who are the mighty warriors who don't have the fears that you have, but will bolster and encourage you and lead you into the presence of God? Who's around you? If you want to bust the fears in your life, worship God. Be in his presence. Act in love to the people around you and surround yourself with mighty warriors who will show you and lead you into the very presence of God, where fear does not exist. I started out by asking you what fears you have. What is the fear lurking in your soul? Maybe you don't know. Here's the thing. The Spirit knows. The Spirit knows exactly what fear is causing you to act or keeping you from acting. The Spirit knows which relationships are being broken because you are filled with fear. The Spirit knows. Ask him. It's a simple question. Holy Spirit, what fear do I have in my life? What fear is there in my soul that you want to bust? What do you need to do today to respond to this? What is God calling you to do? Maybe you need to worship. Maybe you need to create a playlist, and when you're sitting at work or you're driving in the car and the fear is welling up within you, you just need to turn it on and sing at the top of your lungs. Maybe you need to respond differently to the situations in your life, and instead of responding out of fear, act in love. Or maybe you need to get around some people who are mighty warriors, whose fears are not your fears, and who can lead you into the presence of God while at the same time you lead them into the presence of God, because that's what David did for his mighty warriors. Surround yourself. Imagine what might happen, friends, if all of us here today ask the Spirit what our fears are and began to bust those fears, to bring those fears out of the darkness in our soul into the light. Imagine what might happen in your family, in this church, in our city, and even our world, if fear didn't keep us from becoming the person that Jesus envisions. And that's what fear keeps us from becoming, from doing the right things. Let's bust fear together. I want to invite the worship team to come back up. As they do, in silence, let's ask the Spirit this question.